And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay explores the shadow not as pathology or metaphor, but as a philosophical condition that challenges our ideas of coherence, selfhood, and clarity. Drawing on theorists from Jung to Anzaldúa, Foucault to Ahmed, it recasts shadow work as an epistemological and ethical practice, one that refuses resolution in favour of complexity and insists that truth is born not from certainty, but from fidelity to what has been exiled. The shadow becomes a structure of return, a recurring force that reveals how much of what we project onto others originates in disavowed aspects of ourselves. Through the essay's recursive rhythm, we're invited not to master the shadow but to accompany it, to listen rather than declare, to fragment rather than flatten, to think as an act of presence rather than performance. Rather than aiming for closure, the essay performs its own thesis. That integrity lies in how we hold what cannot be resolved. It models a philosophy that values tension over triumph and ethics rooted in attentiveness, not ideology. The shadow does not announce itself. It operates quietly, not as villainy, but as omission. What we cannot yet accept, we unconsciously assign. This displaced material lives not in the margins of our psyche, but in our encounters. The adversary we cannot forgive, the trait we find intolerable, the moment that inexplicably lingers. The language of blame conceals an epistemological error. We mistake the external for the source, when it is often a reflection. To name the shadow is not to moralise, but to listen, to hold the psychic residue of what our narratives exclude. The soul, contrary to rationalist traditions, is not an arena of clarity. It is layered, recursive, and metabolises contradiction over time. Carl Gustav Jung's theory of the shadow remains foundational, not simply for its psychological insight, but for its philosophical implications. Jung argued that the shadow encompasses those parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, often projected onto others. But he also insisted that the shadow is not merely negative, it holds creative and transformative potential. In this, Jung prefigures later thinkers like Julia Kristeva, whose theory of objection complicates our relation to what is cast out. The abject, like the shadow, is both repellent and constitutive. We are defined as much by what we reject as what we affirm. In public life, shadow projection scales. It becomes politics by other means as nations or factions locate evil in the other to maintain a coherent self-image. But the pattern is ancient. Purity requires exile. What changes is the weaponry, linguistic, ideological, or literal. And yet, the philosophical invitation remains to pause when contempt surges and ask not only what we are against, but what within us seeks to locate blame elsewhere. This is not quietism. It is diagnostic ethics. A method for testing whether the enemy we perceive is external or internal, or both. Hannah Arendt's work on the banality of evil offers a critical lens here. In observing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, Arendt did not find a monster but an unthinking bureaucrat, one who had surrendered his moral imagination to structure. Shadow, in this context, is not theatrical, but procedural. It reveals itself not through dramatic violence, but through the failure to question one's role within a system. Arendt's insight suggests that the deepest ethical threat may not be the overt projection of darkness, but the quiet absence of reflection. The capacity to do harm without noticing, because the shadow has been normalised, institutionalised and made invisible through routine. What remains unexamined gathers force. The shadow is not static, it accrues density the longer it is disavowed. When an individual or culture insists too firmly on its innocence, the disowned material doesn't disappear, it relocates. It manifests in compulsions, in moral overcorrections, in the subtle drift toward dehumanization. The philosopher cannot afford to overlook this. To think rigorously is not only to clarify what one believes, but to interrogate why certain beliefs are necessary. What interior anxiety do they shield? What contradiction do they veil? These are not therapeutic questions. They are philosophical ones, requiring the same precision we apply to logic or language. Michel Foucault's concept of power knowledge becomes instructive here. He argued that knowledge is never neutral. It is bound to structures of power that shape what can be said, by whom, and with what consequences. In shadow terms, this suggests that what a society refuses to see is often what it cannot allow itself to speak. Our exclusions of people, histories, effects are not random, they are epistemically structured. The shadow, then, is not only personal, it is produced by discursive regimes that rely on invisibility to preserve coherence. Foucault does not offer redemption, but he does offer method to trace the genealogy of forgetting and to see what systems require omission to survive. In this context, integration is not about harmony, it is about capacity. The aim is not to become unified, but to become plural without fracture. A self that can hold contradiction without collapse becomes politically and relationally dangerous, resistant to manipulation, immune to moral panic, uninterested in scapegoats. Such a self does not need to disown its confusion or its grief. It can speak from them without seeking immediate repair. This is not paralysis. It is ethical readiness, a preparedness to act from awareness rather than reactivity. Simone Weil's writings on attention underscore this readiness. For Weil, attention is not passive perception. It is a moral posture, an act of disciplined, sustained regard toward what one would rather ignore. In refusing distraction, Weil argued, we open ourselves to truth, not as information, but as presence. Shadow work, then, is a training in attention. It refuses to look away from the inconvenient, the painful, the incomplete, not to wallow, but to become accountable to what our consciousness excludes. In this frame, the shadow becomes sacred, not because it is good, but because it is real. And philosophy begins again, not from certainty, but from the stillness required to truly see. Stillness is not absence, it is presence without agenda, the rare state in which perception is not bent to the will of resolution. The philosopher attuned to shadow does not hunt insight like a conclusion, but waits until the shape of the unseen begins to speak. This requires a tolerance for psychic opacity, for the moments when language fails and thought must hold its breath. In a world addicted to explanation, such patience is radical. It counters the demand for coherence with an ethic of duration. Remain with what is not yet clear. Hold it until its texture, not its answer, emerges. This is where transformation lives, not in the story we tell, but in the refusal to tell it too soon. The psychoanalytic tradition, especially as reframed by Jacques Lacan, offers an important scaffold here. Lacan posited that the unconscious is structured like a language, but not a rational one. Desire speaks obliquely through slips, symptoms, repetitions. The subject, in Lacanian terms, is always discentered, split between who they are, what they want, and what the symbolic order allows them to become. The shadow within this frame is not just repressed content, but the residue of what could not be said inside a given symbolic structure. To encounter it is to risk losing the coherence of self, but also to access the space where new forms of meaning might emerge. In other words, shadow work is not a return to wholeness, but a flirtation with symbolic rupture. This rupture is not collapse. It is the opening of a different architecture, one that does not rely on exclusion to sustain identity. Such a self may appear strange to those still committed to moral binaries. It neither denounces nor condones, it recognizes. This form of recognition is not neutrality. It is intimacy without delusion. It says, I see what you are because I have met it in myself. The dangerous impulse, the quiet need, the fear dressed up as righteousness. The voice that echoes louder in condemnation than it ever would in confession. To recognize these is not to absolve, it is to shift the grounds on which we judge. Less from distance, more from contact. Less from fear, more from fidelity to the whole. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has argued that emotions are not irrational forces to be conquered, but evaluative appraisals, windows into what matters. Anger, shame, envy, each points to a vision of the good, however distorted. Shadow work, seen through this lens, becomes a form of moral epistemology. It teaches us to read our emotional reactions not simply as personal failures, but as misaligned insights, signals from values that remain unexamined or wounded. The work is to trace those values, not to discard them, to feel our way carefully back into ethical relation. Not through ideology, but through the slow reconstruction of care. Care, in this context, is not sentimentality, it is structure. It is the deliberate act of making space for what discomforts us without requiring it to perform or resolve. In a shadow-informed ethics, care becomes the counterforce to projection. Where projection offloads, care absorbs. Where projection simplifies, care sustains complexity. To care is to remain with the fragment, the flaw, the contradiction, not in the hope of fixing it, but in the recognition that it too belongs. This form of care is slow, unspectacular, and often invisible. It will not go viral. It cannot be monetized. But it is the only field in which integration becomes possible, not as an event, but as an ongoing disposition. This resonates with the moral philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, whose work insists that the face of the other constitutes an ethical demand prior to any theory or system. For Levinas, the otherness of the other cannot be reduced to categories or comprehension. It calls us into responsibility before we have time to decide. Shadow work, read through Levinas, becomes an encounter not only with the parts of ourselves we avoid, but with the unassimilable strangeness in others. The demand is not to understand or master, but to respond, to remain ethically proximate even in the absence of resolution. The shadow, then, is not simply a mirror, it is also a threshold to the ethical other, asking, can you stay near what you do not name? Naming can be a violence if it arrives too soon. The desire to name often masks the fear of being undone. Philosophically, this reveals a deeper question. What kind of self do we want to be? One who preserves its stability through projection, or one who expands its integrity through encounter? The shadow offers no shortcuts. It humbles. It strips away heroic narratives. It makes a mess of identity and then invites us to live there in the middle of that mess with grace. Not cleanliness, not closure. Grace. The ability to live with what is unresolved, not as defect, but as condition. This ethic is echoed in the existential tradition, particularly in the writing of Søren Kierkegaard, who warned against the aesthetic life, one that flees from despair by avoiding inwardness. For Kierkegaard, despair is not simply suffering, it is the refusal to become oneself. Shadow work in this existential frame is not about perfection, but about movement toward the difficult, the dissonant, the unclaimed. It is the work of becoming singular in the face of contradiction, and it is slow, but it is honest. And in this slowness, philosophy reclaims its ancient task, not to deliver certainty, but to hold space for the human condition in all its unspeakable depth. To hold space is not merely to wait, it is to endure without collapse. The work of the shadow is measured by what we are able to stay with, not what we are able to solve. In a culture dominated by acceleration and display, such endurance is countercultural. It requires silence in the face of noise, inwardness in the presence of spectacle. Yet this refusal to perform is not withdrawal. It is a deeper form of engagement, an attention that neither flinches nor forces. It allows the shadow to emerge not as threat but as contour. What once felt foreign begins to appear familiar, not because it is safe, but because we have stopped insisting on safety as the ground of relation. This quality of relation echoes in the philosophy of Martin Buber, particularly in his concept of the I-thou encounter. Buber distinguishes between relations that treat the other as an object, I-it, and those that meet the other as presence, I-thou. In the I-thou relation, one does not reduce or use the other but allows them to be in their fullness. Shadow work can be understood as the internal practice of I-thou, to meet one's own exiled parts not as problems to fix but as beings to acknowledge, is to transform the psyche from battlefield to dialogue. The fragmented self becomes a society, not of adversaries, but of interlocutors. The inner voice that was once denied becomes a participant in meaning. And this changes what philosophy sounds like. The language softens. Certainties taper. Not because conviction disappears, but because it is now earned through encounter, not assertion. This is where a deeper integrity forms, not from being unbroken, but from refusing to exile what broke us. The shadow does not disappear. It is metabolized. It becomes part of the grammar of thought. Our metaphors carry it. Our pauses signal it. Our ethics evolve not through system design, but through the labour of inclusion, sentence by sentence, breath by breath. We see this inclusive movement in the work of bell hooks, who articulated love as an ethical practice rooted in justice. For Hooks, love is not sentiment. It is action, attention, and the willingness to confront harm without reproducing it. The shadow, then, is not merely a private phenomenon. It is a site of political and emotional literacy. To reckon with it is to interrupt cycles of unconscious violence. It is to turn inward, not for self-absorption, but for self-accountability. From this, solidarity becomes possible, not the performance of unity, but the mutual recognition of struggle. The shadow teaches us this, that to become more whole is not to erase what is difficult, but to carry it with more care. To carry with care is to inhabit a new temporality. The shadow does not obey the clock. It returns in rhythms we do not control. What was buried 10 years ago might surface in a single word, a gesture, a dream. And when it does, the invitation is not to interrogate it into silence, but to welcome it with a disciplined gentleness. This gentleness is not weakness. It is a form of moral stamina, the ability to stay near what unsettles without needing to destroy or domesticate it. Such stamina is rare because it asks us to release the illusion that we are finished becoming. It treats the self not as a conclusion, but as a porous, recursive field, always gathering, always losing, always listening again. Cornel West speaks of this field in his reflections on prophetic pragmatism. He writes that the task of the intellectual is not simply critique, but compassion rooted in suffering, an embrace of woundedness that neither glamorizes nor escapes. West's ethic is shadow literate. He insists that pain must be honoured without being weaponized, and that hope, to be real, must be born from brokenness, not denial. In this register becomes a form of ethical preparation for democracy, not the procedural kind, but the intimate one. The democracy of the self, the capacity to host conflicting voices within, to practice justice before preaching it, to build a kind of inner pluralism that can hold the contradictions of the world without needing to resolve them prematurely. That inner pluralism is not chaos, it is architecture. The self becomes a structure with multiple rooms, some familiar, others still locked. Philosophy's role is not to furnish only the well-lit spaces, but to help us find the courage to open the closed doors. Not all of them will yield meaning immediately. Some contain silence, others hold echoes of injuries too raw to name. But if we can remain with humility, we may begin to hear those echoes differently, not as threats, but as the grammar of a deeper self. A self not cleansed of its contradictions, but capable of housing them with care. In this sense, Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology offers a fitting close to the arc we've travelled. For Merleau-Ponty, perception is not an abstract act of mind, but a bodily situated engagement with the world. We do not think from above, we think from within. The shadow, reimagined phenomenologically, is not something hidden in the basement of the psyche. It is something textured, felt and encountered in how we move, react and relate. To know the shadow is to know ourselves not as coherent thinkers, but as perceiving bodies, entangled, responsive, unfinished. And perhaps that is the most honest form of philosophy we can practice, to remain present, fractured and awake. To remain present, fractured and awake is to abandon the fantasy of philosophical mastery. The shadow does not grant conclusions, it dismantles them. It leaves the thinker not with authority, but with fidelity, a fidelity to what remains unresolved, to what continues to speak even after the analysis ends. This fidelity reshapes our sense of intellectual strength. No longer defined by dominance, strength becomes the willingness to be permeable, to be transformed by what one does not yet understand. In this space, vulnerability is not an impediment to thought, it is its condition. It allows philosophy to move beyond abstraction and return to its original terrain, the life of the human soul, in all its contradiction and depth. This conception of philosophical vulnerability finds deep resonance in the writings of Judith Butler. Through her work on performativity, precarity and ethics, Butler consistently returns to the idea that identity is not fixed but constructed and sustained through repetition, and that this repetition opens us to risk. We are never fully sovereign, never entirely secure. Instead, we are relational, exposed, contingent. Shadow work through Butler's lens becomes an acknowledgement of that exposure. It is a practice of undoing the illusion of a stable, knowable self and replacing it with a commitment to ethical responsiveness. The parts of us we deny do not disappear. They haunt our gestures, our speech, our silences. To face the shadow is to admit our dependence on others for recognition and to choose, still, to be accountable. Accountability is not an event. It is an ethic of rhythm. A return, again and again, to the sites of avoidance, not to punish, but to understand. This understanding is not passive, It is not the quiet acceptance of harm, but the courage to remain in proximity to discomfort until its contours are revealed. Only then does action become just. Only then does thought become real. The shadow does not seek to paralyze us with guilt, but to prevent us from acting out of disavowed fear. It wants us to pause long enough to ask, is this mine? Is this projection? Is this the echo of an unspoken need? From there, a new kind of clarity can emerge, not sharp, but deep. Not absolute, but durable. This durability is what allows philosophy to stay close to the human. It resists both the coldness of pure abstraction and the chaos of unchecked emotion. It walks between them, anchored, attentive, fractured, and still capable of coherence. Not the coherence of simplicity, but the coherence of form held in tension. The shadow holds that tension for us until we are ready to take it back. And when we do, we begin to write not from what we know, but from what we are learning to bear. To write from what we are learning to bear is to relinquish the demand that thought must always feel triumphant. Shadow-aware philosophy does not offer for resolution as its gift. It offers texture. Its value lies not in the clarity of its claims, but in the gravity of its questions. It is philosophy as presence, thinking that is tethered to experience, shaped by loss, sharpened by recognition. This form of thought is neither therapeutic nor nihilistic. It neither heals nor dismantles for its own sake. Instead, it asks what kind of meaning can emerge when we stop insisting on being whole and begin practicing the art of being honest. It replaces transcendence with recurrence, purity with permeability, finality with return. This ethos is embedded in the hermeneutics of Paul Ricoeur, whose concept of the wounded cogito reframes subjectivity not as foundational certainty, but as a site marked by fragility and restoration. For Ricoeur, we do not move from doubt to knowledge as Descartes imagined. We move from brokenness to interpretation. We are not autonomous thinkers, but narrators of fractured selves, seeking coherence without denying rupture. The shadow in this schema is not simply what we hide. It is what interrupts our narration and demands to be reread. It is the footnote that changes the thesis, the silence that reframes the statement. To integrate it is not to erase the wound, but to write from its edge with care. And so, philosophy returns not to a final insight, but to a deepened posture. The work has not been to complete a system, but to reconfigure the self who needs one. The thinker who has entered the shadow field no longer seeks authority through certainty. They seek resonance through presence. Their voice shifts. Their metaphors become slower. Their sentences more porous. They are no longer trying to convince. They are inviting us to remain with the ambiguity, with the contradiction, with the parts of ourselves that will never be made tidy. The task is no longer to resolve the shadow, but to accompany it. And in doing so, we discover that our shadows were never only ours. They were inherited, shared, cultural, systemic. To see this is not to dilute responsibility. It is to widen it. To understand that shadow work is not merely a personal reckoning, but a philosophical stance toward the collective. It is the recognition that we live inside each other's projections, and that to do the work sincerely is to become less violent with our words, less efficient with our judgments, more deliberate with our attention. This is the long discipline, the quiet revolution, the beginning again. The beginning again is not a return to origin, but a recalibration of orientation. To begin from within the shadow is to accept that thought does not move linearly and that wisdom often arrives through undoing rather than accumulation. This is not a failure of reason, but a refinement of it, a shift from philosophy as architecture to philosophy as atmosphere. It no longer aspires to build unassailable structures of certainty, but to dwell with integrity in spaces of partial knowing. The shadow teaches us that clarity achieved through exclusion is fragile. Real clarity arises when we allow what was excluded to re-enter, not to dominate, but to reshape the terms of the conversation. This reshaping is echoed in the political philosophy of Gloria Anzaldúa, whose theory of la facultad, a deep inner sensing developed by those on the margins, reconfigures what counts as knowledge. For Anzaldúa, the shadow is not just psychological but geopolitical. It is produced by borders, both internal and imposed. Her borderlands are not merely physical, they are epistemic territories where contradictions coexist and identity is forged through tension, not coherence. To walk through such terrain is to learn how to listen differently to the body, to silence, to ghosts. In Anzaldua's register, shadow work becomes survival work, but also visionary work. It is the practice of seeing in the dark, of becoming literate in ambiguity, of claiming space in a world that would rather you remain fractured. To become literate in ambiguity is to develop a form of ethical imagination, not the fantasy of innocence or purity, but the willingness to imagine from within the mess. This is not easy. The cultural momentum pushes us toward performance, toward simplicity, toward resolution as validation. But the philosopher who commits to shadow refuses those shortcuts. They accept that some truths will only arrive after detours, that some insights require loss, that some recognitions will cost us the very narratives we thought we needed to live, and still they remain. Not because they enjoy discomfort, but because they understand that what lies on the other side of discomfort is not safety, but depth. And depth is where philosophy meets the sacred, not as dogma, but as density. When we speak from the shadow, we are not speaking less clearly, we are speaking with more weight. Our words are slower, but they land differently. They carry not just thought, but time and wound and return. They are not declarations, but invitations. And in the echo of those invitations, something shifts. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to mark the beginning again, not from innocence, but from presence. Not from light, but from the strange, necessary wisdom of what we dared at last to turn toward. To turn toward the shadow is to enter a fidelity that precedes explanation. It is the quiet decision to no longer look away, even when nothing yet makes sense. This kind of fidelity is not heroic. It does not arrive with trumpets or transformation. It is often small, invisible, even unnoticed by the self. It looks like hesitation before judgment, a pause in the familiar script, a breath taken before projecting a pattern onto another. In these seemingly minor acts, philosophy reclaims its ethical edge, not as the domain of great ideas alone, but as the practice of minute internal revolutions. Here, truth is not a matter of evidence alone. It is a matter of attention, what we are willing to notice, and how long we are willing to stay there. Sara Ahmed's work on affective economies clarifies what's at stake. She explores how emotions circulate within cultures, not as private feelings, but as public orientations that bind subjects to collective identities. Hatred, fear, disgust. These are not only reactions, but vectors of belonging. We are taught whom to fear, whom to blame, what to feel shame about. In this sense, the shadow is not only within the self, but sedimented into the emotional grammar of a culture. To do shadow work, then, is to become disoriented, to feel the pull of those emotional economies and resist their momentum. Ahmed calls this willfulness, the decision to not flow smoothly within the given emotional current. Shadow work, at its most political, is an act of willful interruption, and yet interruption alone is not enough. It must be followed by a willingness to metabolize what surfaces when the flow stops. Often what appears is not grand revelation, but a flicker, a half-memory, a faint echo of past injury, a sentence you once spoke with certainty that now tastes of fear. These are not distractions, they are data. They are the psyche's way of showing its scaffolding. Philosophy, when it is mature, pays attention to these fragments, not to master them, but to be reshaped by them, to allow the thought to bend, to sag under the weight of lived complexity and still find its form. This is thought as kinship, not conquest. And in this kinship, a different kind of knowing emerges. Not the knowing of certainty, but the knowing of resonance. When something unspoken is finally named and the body relaxes around it. This is the gift of the shadow. It does not teach us what to think, but how to listen. It undoes our grip on control and asks instead for devotion. Not to the ego, but to the full ecology of the self, including what has been left out, suppressed or feared. To live from this place is not to be healed. It is to be human, deeply, unusually, and without reserve. To live without reserve is not to abandon discernment, but to inhabit it differently. The philosopher shaped by shadow no longer uses judgment as shield, but as mirror. They do not retreat from meaning, but they approach it with softened hands, hands capable of holding contradiction without crushing it into ideology. In such a posture, the difference between assertion and presence becomes visible. Assertion seeks to finalize, presence allows continuation. The thinker becomes less interested in the performance of insight and more devoted to the conditions that allow insight to emerge. This shift does not diminish the rigour of thought. It deepens it. It weaves complexity into coherence, not by force, but by fidelity to the real. This fidelity aligns with the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, whose reflections on being with dissolve the notion of isolated subjectivity. For Nancy, existence is always already shared. The self is constituted in relation, never in solitude. There is no I without a simultaneous with. Shadow work within this ontological frame becomes the practice of rejoining what we pretended was separate, the parts of ourselves exiled through fear, shame, or pride. The internal shadow echoes the external one. What I disavow in myself, I cannot truly meet in you. And so the philosophical task becomes re-relational, not merely to think clearly, but to relate truthfully with the world, with others, with the layered terrain of the self. To relate truthfully requires a tolerance for partialness. The shadow never arrives whole. It enters consciousness in fragments, in a dream, a stumble, a repeated phrase we can't explain. These fragments resist systemization. They refuse to become doctrine. And yet they press inward, asking to be named, not for the sake of clarity, but for the sake of return. Each naming is a gesture of homecoming, a way of letting what was once exiled sit again at the table. The table, of course, shifts. It expands, it becomes messier, but it also becomes more honest, more able to hold the kind of difficult beauty that refuses spectacle. This is the beauty that philosophy too often avoids, the beauty of the broken line, the unfinished thought, the insight that arrives as a question rather than a claim. Shadow work restores these as legitimate philosophical forms. It defends the fragment not as failure, but as form. It reclaims the pause as a site of meaning. And it teaches us, slowly, insistently, that the deepest truths do not rise from what we declare, but from what we are finally willing to face. To face what has long been avoided is not to conquer it, but to allow it to unfold on its own terms. The shadow does not respond to interrogation, it responds to hospitality. This hospitality is philosophical in nature, a welcoming of what disrupts our frameworks and makes us strangers to ourselves. In this context, thinking becomes less an act of definition and more an act of accompaniment. We walk alongside our contradictions rather than eliminating them. We stop asking the psyche to justify itself. Instead, we begin listening for how meaning wants to move through memory, sensation, image. This is not the abandonment of philosophy. It is its return to breath, to ground, to the rhythm of life as it is. This movement toward accompaniment echoes the work of Adriana Cavarero, particularly in her critique of abstract identity in favour of narratable selfhood. For Cavarero, the self is not a static, knowable object, but a story told in relation, always incomplete, always vulnerable to revision. Shadow work, in this view, becomes a narrative responsibility, the act of reauthoring the self to include the silenced chapters, the unreliable narrators, the missing voices. The ethical question is not whether we are coherent, but whether we are honest about our fragmentation. Philosophy, when aligned with this ethic, does not ask for purity of thought, but for courage in telling. In this way, the essay itself becomes a form of shadow practice, an effort not to explain but to witness the self as it evolves through speech. Such witnessing is slow work. It asks us to stay near what trembles, to see knowledge not as possession but as proximity. This challenges the habits of institutional philosophy, which often valorize certainty and speed. But when we write or speak from shadow, we enter a different clock. We speak more like weather than theorem, gradual, layered, often circling back. Insight becomes meteorological, not forced into shape, but shaped by pressure, by pause, by air. What begins to matter is not whether the argument lands, but whether it listens as it goes. Listening, then, is not preparation for thought. It is thought. It is what allows fragments to become form without erasure. The philosopher trained in shadow work is no longer seeking clean lines. They are composing with rupture, allowing dissonance to echo long enough to become resonance. What results is not closure, but coherence of a different kind. A coherence rooted in complexity, humility, and the quiet discipline of staying. Not to solve, not to save, but to remain, until the unspeakable becomes language, and the unlivable becomes part of the life we are finally willing to claim. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.